Vivian Marsh fed $4.2 million into the shredder one slow inch at a time, and she watched the little girl's face while she did it. The machine chewed the certified check into thin ribbons that curled onto the floor behind the counter, and 7-year-old Nora Monroe followed each one down, with her eyes still holding the grape lollipop a teller had handed her 20 minutes earlier, back when this had still been an ordinary Thursday. Her father did not move. He had learned a long time ago that stillness was the only thing a black man was ever allowed to carry into a room like this, that the smallest sudden motion could be rewritten by frightened strangers into something it was not. "Money like this does not belong to people like you," Vivian said, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. "And I am not going to stand here and pretend that it does." Then she picked up the phone and called the police to report a fraud in progress. Elias Monroe drew his daughter against his hip and told the manager, in a voice so low she had to lean across the counter to catch it, that she had just made the most expensive decision of her life. A security guard started toward him. And that was the moment the glass doors sighed open, and a man in a gray suit stepped inside, saw the shredded paper fanned across the tile, and stopped as though he had walked into a pane of glass. "Mr. Monroe," the man said. The color drained out of his face. "What happened here? Here is what none of them knew." Not the manager. Not the crowd, with their phones raised like a row of small cold moons. Not even the girl gripping two of his fingers so hard they had gone white. Elias had stood in a room exactly like this one before, on the wrong side of a counter, watching someone he loved be treated as though the color of her skin were proof of a crime. He had been 7 years old then, the same age his daughter was now. And the woman folding herself smaller under a stranger's stare had been his mother. Before I take you back to the beginning, if this story finds something real in you, subscribe, because the next one will be waiting when you need it most. Now let me tell you how a quiet man and his daughter ended up on the wrong side of a counter, and why, this time, he did not fold. Elias Monroe was 44 years old, a black man, who had spent his whole life being seen by strangers long before he was ever heard by them. For 5 years he had raised Nora alone in a narrow brick house on the edge of Charlotte, North Carolina, on a street where most people knew him only as the quiet neighbor with the old pickup and the canvas coat he had worn since before she was born. Her mother had died when Nora was 2. Elias had not remarried, had not moved, had not changed much of anything, because grief had taught him that the ordinary things were the ones worth keeping. He drove Nora to school every morning, and folded a note into her lunchbox every day, the way his own mother had once folded notes into his, back when a folded piece of paper was the most valuable thing either of them owned. What none of the parents at Nora's school knew was that the man in the worn coat had built Stillwater Equity Partners out of a single rented room into a firm that quietly moved billions. Elias had made sure of their not knowing. He drove the same second-hand truck. He wore the same watch he had bought 11 years earlier. He kept his success folded into the background of an unremarkable life, because he had grown up watching too many rooms decide what a black man was allowed to be before he opened his mouth, and he had spent his whole life refusing to perform wealth just to earn the ordinary decency that should have been free. He remembered the bank from when he was 7 with a clarity that never softened. His mother Della in her good coat, the one she saved for church and for anything that frightened her, holding a paycheck from the company whose offices she cleaned at night. He remembered the teller's face change the moment she looked up and saw her. He remembered a manager being called over, and the word fraud said too loudly, and the exact sound his mother made when she finally stopped arguing, a small breath that was almost an apology, as though she were sorry for having asked a bank to treat her money the way it treated everyone else's. She had folded the check into her palm and walked them both out into the cold. On the bus home she had told Elias quietly that the world would try, again and again, to make him feel small, and that he must never once agree to it. He had promised her he would not. He had been keeping that promise for 37 years. That morning a certified check for $4.2 million had cleared into his name, the proceeds of an early stake he had sold in a company most people had never heard of, until it started making headlines. He already knew where the money was going. Half would go into a trust for Nora, sealed until she was old enough to understand what it meant to be handed something she had not earned. The other half was meant to open a fund for children being raised by a single parent, and he had already chosen its name. He was going to call it the Elias Monroe Fund, after a woman who had cleaned offices at night, so her son would never have to, and who had died before she ever got to see the kind of room her name might one day open for children the world had already decided not to expect much from. He brought Nora, because they had a plan for the rest of the day. The bank first, then the little bookstore on Hadley Street, then an early dinner at the pancake place she loved by the river. 10 minutes, he had told her, a formality. He had even promised her 3 books instead of the usual one, because the sky was clear, and he was, for once, in an easy mood. They walked into the Brookline branch of Camden Federal Trust a little before closing. Elias had banked there for 16 years, since before Nora was born. But the woman at the manager's desk, Vivian Marsh, had transferred in only a month earlier, and she did not know any of that. She had never pulled his account. She looked at the coat, and the truck at the curb, and the black father, with a child at his side, and she decided she already knew everything about him worth knowing. Her eyes did the arithmetic Elias had watched 1,000 rooms do, the quick and practiced sum, that turned a man into a suspicion, before he had said a word. A couple in pressed business clothes came in behind them, and were greeted, before they reached the counter. Elias and Nora stood, while 2 tellers found reasons to look busy. Nora tugged his sleeve, and whispered, asking why nobody was helping them. He told her to be patient. Then, because she was Della's granddaughter even, if she would never get the chance to know it, he added that patience was not the same thing as agreeing to be invisible. When he finally reached the counter, he set the check down, and asked for it to be deposited into the account he had held for 16 years. The number caught the teller's eye at once, and within seconds Vivian was standing behind the counter herself. Instead of pulling up his account, or checking the history attached to his name, something any manager could have done in under a minute, she began questioning him about where the money had come from, her voice pitched loud enough for half the lobby to follow along, in a tone she had not once used, with a customer before him. Elias answered every question, without letting his voice climb. He handed over his license, his bank card, his account number, and the paperwork confirming the sale of his shares. He offered to let her call the issuing bank directly, and verify all of it herself in a matter of minutes. By any reasonable standard it was far more than enough for a transaction that should have taken no time at all. Vivian looked at the documents, without truly reading them. A man like him, she told him, and she let the phrase land exactly the way she meant it, did not walk into a bank carrying $4 million, not in a truck like that, not in a coat like that. A young teller named Elena Rees offered to make the verification call herself. Vivian cut her off, before she could reach the phone, and ordered her back to her station in a tone that left no room for argument. By then several customers had noticed the tension gathering at the counter, and a few had already raised their phones. One man said loud enough for Nora to hear that people like that always had a story ready, and that he had probably borrowed the little girl to make it look more convincing. Nobody in the lobby spoke against the comment. They simply held their phones a little higher, and waited to see how far it would go. Nora's hand found her father's, and gripped it tight, the last of her earlier confidence draining out of her all at once. And Elias felt something he had not felt in 37 years, the specific cold of a room deciding about you in advance, the same cold he had felt on a bus seat beside his mother. He kept his voice level, and asked Vivian, one more time, to place the call, before this went any further. His calm only seemed to provoke her. In front of the tellers, the guard, and every raised phone, she declared the check fraudulent, though she had not verified a single detail of it. Elias reminded her, evenly, that she was handling a customer's legitimate property, and would want to think carefully about what she did next. She heard the warning as a threat. She lifted the check off the counter, looked him dead in the eye, and told him that money like this did not belong to people like him. And every person in that lobby understood exactly what she meant. And this is where you came in. She fed it into the shredder mounted beside her terminal, and let the ribbons fall in full view of his daughter. The lobby went silent. Nora bent as if to gather the pieces, and Elias stopped her gently, unwilling to let his child kneel on a floor to collect what a stranger had just used to make her small. He thought of his mother folding a check into her palm. He thought of a promise made on a cold bus. And for the first time in his adult life, he understood that keeping it was going to cost him something in front of the person he most wanted to protect. Vivian called the police, telling the dispatcher that a black man was using fraudulent documents, that he was threatening her staff, and refusing to leave. 3 lies stacked one on top of the other, and the first word of her description was the one she reached for first, as though the color of his skin were the most important fact in the room, and the rest were only details. She ordered the branch guard, Walter Boyd, to walk Elias out. Walter hesitated before stepping forward, uncertain why he was being asked to remove a man who had done nothing but stand quietly at a counter. But a direct order from a manager left him little room to argue in front of a lobby full of witnesses. Nora looked up at the approaching guard, with a fear no 7-year-old should have to carry into a bank on an ordinary afternoon. Elias tightened his hand around hers, and told her, low enough that only she could hear, that everything would be fine, as long as she stayed close. He understood exactly the position he was in, understood it in a way the people filming never would. He could resist, and hand them the story they had already decided to tell about him, or he could stay calm, and let the truth catch up. He chose to stay calm. But he refused to walk out the door before someone confirmed what he already knew to be true. He glanced at the ribbons on the tile, the seed of a fund that had not even had the chance to exist yet, and felt something settle in his chest that was not anger. It was closer to certainty. Walter's grip stayed light on his arm as they moved toward the doors, more a suggestion than a hold. Nora could not stop looking back at the shredded paper. She wrapped both arms around her father's waist, pressed her face into his side, and asked the guard in a small voice not to take her dad away. Walter's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, caught between an order and the plain evidence of his own eyes. From behind the counter, Vivian called for a teller to keep the child back, so she could not be used to obstruct staff. It was the first time Elias felt his calm crack. He had absorbed the accusations, the remarks about his coat and his truck, even the sight of his own money turned to confetti in front of strangers. But the instant someone suggested laying a hand on Nora, his voice changed entirely. He told the teller, in a tone that left no room for negotiation, that no one was to touch his daughter. Vivian seized on it at once, telling the gathering crowd that his sudden intensity was proof of the very danger she had been warning them about since he walked in, and Elias understood, with a weariness older than that afternoon, how easily his fear for his child could be handed back to him as evidence against him. There is a lie that comfortable rooms like to tell themselves, that racism is loud, that it wears a hood, or shouts a slur, that you would surely recognize it, and stop it, if it ever stood in front of you. Elias had learned, as a boy, that the truth is quieter, and far more patient than that. It rarely shouts. It simply decides, before you have said a word, whose check is real, and whose is a crime, which door you are allowed to walk through and which one you will be walked out of, and then dares you to make a scene, so it can call you the problem. He lowered his voice. He kept his hands visible at his sides. He pulled Nora against his hip, away from the guard, and made himself as calm as a man can be, while a stranger rewrites him in real time. Elena spoke up a second time. She reminded Vivian, as steadily as she could manage, that Elias had threatened no one, and that a single phone call would end the entire matter in minutes. Vivian rounded on her, and threatened to fire her on the spot if she said one more word in front of customers. Elena went quiet, but she did not look away, and something in her face said she believed him even if she could not say so out loud, without risking everything. She had worked at the branch just over a year, long enough to have watched Vivian dismiss more than one customer in ways that never sat right, and long enough to have told herself, each time, that it was not her place to speak. Watching Nora's face come apart, she understood that whatever she had told herself before no longer held. Nora looked around at all the raised phones and the lowered eyes, and asked her father, in a voice just loud enough to carry, whether anyone in the room would say that he had done nothing wrong. Several people looked away. Nobody answered. Nobody moved. Elias felt that silence land harder than anything Vivian had said, because he understood, watching his daughter, that she was learning the same lesson he had learned on a bus at her age, that a whole room can agree, through nothing but silence, that an injustice in plain sight requires no one to do anything at all. Vivian watched them move toward the doors, with her arms folded, satisfied the matter had been handled, unaware that the man walking away held more influence over the future of her branch than she could have imagined 10 minutes earlier. And at that exact moment the door swung open, and Charles Denning walked in, a leather folder under one arm, wearing the unhurried posture of a man expecting a quiet late meeting. Charles was the regional president for the Southeastern Division of Camden Federal Trust, and he had come to the Brookline branch specifically to meet Elias, after hours, away from the attention a public meeting might draw. The two of them were finalizing a $600 million lending partnership between the bank and Stillwater Equity, a deal months in the making, and set to close within the week. He took 2 steps inside, before he understood what he was looking at, the man he had spent an hour preparing to meet standing, with a guard's hand on his shoulder, while his daughter clung to his side in tears, the floor behind the counter littered with shredded paper he did not need anyone to explain. His folder slipped from his hand and hit the tile with a flat slap. For a moment he simply stood there, measuring the distance between the meeting he had walked in expecting and the scene in front of him. Then he said the 2 words that changed the temperature of the entire room. "Mr. Monroe." His voice carried an authority that turned every head. Walter released Elias and stepped back, as though the shoulder he had been holding had become something he had no right to touch. Vivian hurried toward Charles and began explaining, quickly, that she had just prevented a multi-million-dollar fraud. Charles looked at her for a long moment, before asking whether she had any idea who the man in front of her actually was. She opened her mouth, then closed it, realizing for the first time that the question was not rhetorical. In front of every customer still in the lobby, Charles explained that Elias Monroe was the founder of Stillwater Equity Partners, one of the largest institutional clients the bank held, and that Stillwater was in the final stage of a $600 million agreement Elias alone had the authority to approve, or walk away from. The check was entirely legitimate. The issuing bank had sent written confirmation, that very morning, a confirmation Vivian had never once bothered to check, before deciding what she believed about the man at her counter. Then Charles crouched to Nora's eye level, and apologized to her directly for what had happened inside a bank that carried the same name as the one on his card. It was the first time, since they walked through the doors, that anyone in the building had spoken to Nora, as though her fear mattered, and she looked up at her father, as if checking whether it was safe to believe it. 2 words had been enough to reverse everything, and that was the part Elias could not stop turning over even as it happened. The same worn coat, the same face, the same daughter, and all it had taken to make the room see a man instead of a threat was a wealthier man arriving to vouch for him. The customers lowered their phones, though not one of them deleted the footage in their pockets. The tellers found reasons to look busy. The man who had loudly suggested Elias was using his daughter as a prop now stood near the door studying his shoes. Vivian straightened her blazer and cleared her throat, as though composure alone might undo the last several minutes, and then, rather than accept responsibility, she insisted that Elias bore some of the blame. A man carrying that kind of money, she said, should have dressed the part, or announced himself the moment he walked in. Elias asked her, without raising his voice, whether a customer had to be wealthy or well-known before he deserved basic decency, or whether it was simply that some customers were assumed to have earned suspicion the moment they walked through the door. She answered that she had only been following procedure, repeating the word twice, as though saying it often enough might make it true. Charles gestured to the ribbons on the floor and asked her to name the exact procedure that authorized a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal property in front of his child. "There is no such procedure," he said flatly. "There never has been." While attention stayed fixed on the two men, Vivian slipped behind her terminal and tried to delete an internal note she had added to the account only minutes earlier, one that flagged Elias as a threatening customer at high risk of fraud. Elena caught the movement out of the corner of her eye, crossed the lobby, and placed a hand firmly over the keyboard, stopping the deletion mid-motion. "The note stays exactly where it is," she told Vivian, and then she turned to Charles and told him that the branch cameras had recorded the entire incident, from 3 angles, including the moment the check went into the shredder. Vivian's face went pale, as though she had forgotten the whole exchange had been captured on film, from the second Elias walked through the door. Charles removed Vivian from her position on the spot, in the lobby, in front of the same customers, who had watched her destroy the check minutes earlier. She asked to have the conversation privately in an office. He refused. She had humiliated Mr. Monroe in public, he said, and she would answer for it in front of the same people who had witnessed it, not behind a closed door, where the consequences might quietly disappear. Turning to Walter, he took a more measured tone. The footage showed the guard had never used force, and had let go the instant he was told to. He suspended Walter pending review rather than firing him, telling him the time would let them both look at the recording clearly, before deciding anything permanent. Walter nodded, his shoulders dropping somewhere between relief and shame. "I knew something felt wrong," he said, mostly to himself. "I just did not trust that feeling enough to say it out loud." The police arrived not long after, responding to the call Vivian had placed. 2 officers walked in scanning the lobby, and for a moment Elias felt a fear that had nothing to do with the shredded check on the floor. It was the older, deeper fear that lived in the body of every black parent, who understood how a single false phone call could turn an ordinary afternoon into something no one walked away from, and without being told he made sure his hands stayed visible, and his daughter stayed behind him. Charles stepped forward at once, and explained that the original report had been false, but the officers still had to file an incident report, since the call had already been logged as a complaint. One of them apologized, while taking Elias's account, admitting under his breath that the dispatch had described a completely different situation than the one they had walked into. Elena gave her statement, without hesitation, describing everything she had seen and heard, including the moment Vivian had threatened to fire her for offering to make a phone call. Several customers handed over their video. A few apologized to Elias, while they waited, admitting they should have spoken up the moment the questioning began instead of only reaching for their phones. One 10-second clip, showing the check disappearing into the shredder, while Nora watched, was online before the officers had finished. By the time Elias and Nora left the building that evening, it already had thousands of views, and within hours it had spread far beyond Charlotte. News vans appeared outside the Brookline branch before the sun had set. Reporters learned that Elias was a widowed black father who had raised his daughter alone for 5 years, and that the money the manager had destroyed had been meant to open a fund named after his late mother for children being raised by a single parent. The distance between what the money was meant to do and how its owner had been treated deepened the outrage with every share. Camden Federal stock began to slide, and the board convened an emergency session that evening, pressing Charles to do whatever it took to keep Elias from walking away from the $600 million deal. More than one executive suggested quietly settling before the story grew larger. Charles refused each time, telling them that Elias Monroe did not strike him as a man who could be bought into silence. An internal investigation launched in the following days uncovered a pattern far larger than a single afternoon. Vivian had a documented history of freezing or denying accounts belonging to black customers and customers with lower incomes, and earlier complaints against her had been quietly dismissed by branch leadership long before Elias ever walked in. Investigators found at least a dozen prior complaints sitting untouched in old files, each closed without any real review. Employees who had stayed silent for years suddenly found themselves being asked why nothing had ever been done. Some had assumed the complaints were handled above their level. Others admitted they had simply been afraid of losing their own jobs. One former teller told investigators she had reported an almost identical incident 2 years earlier, involving an elderly black customer, whose account Vivian had frozen, without explanation, and that her report had been closed, within a week, and buried in a file nobody reopened, until a $4 million check ended up in ribbons on the same lobby floor. But the sharpest blow of all did not come from the board or the reporters. It came from Nora, later that first evening, as she sat across from her father at the kitchen table, pushing food around a plate neither of them had the appetite to finish. She looked up and asked whether anyone would have apologized at all if they had not found out he was rich. Elias set down his fork and looked at his daughter for a long moment, searching for an answer that would not feel like a lie. He had none. He thought of his mother, who had never been found out, who had never had a man in a gray suit walk through the door in time to say her name, who had carried her humiliation home on a bus, and told her son only that he must never agree to be made small. His money had bought him an apology his mother was never offered. And the true measure of that bank, he understood, was never going to be how it treated him the moment it learned who he was. It was how it had treated him, and his mother, and every customer who looked like them in the 10 minutes before it knew. The lawyers came to the house 3 days later, dressed in suits that looked out of place against the modest porch and the truck in the driveway. They arrived with an offer already prepared, a financial settlement, a public apology, and the removal of several employees, all in exchange for one condition. Elias would sign the $600 million agreement, as planned, and say nothing further about what had happened inside the Brookline branch. They laid the paperwork across the same kitchen table, where Nora had asked her question, and walked him through the numbers, as though the size of the settlement alone might close the matter. Elias listened to the whole proposal without interrupting. Part of him wanted to take Nora somewhere far from cameras and never set foot in a Camden branch again. But he kept returning to her question, the one that had followed him into every quiet moment since, and to a promise made on a cold bus 37 years before. Punishing Vivian and forcing a public apology would satisfy his own anger, and do nothing for the next person who walked in, without a regional president waiting nearby to vouch for them. His mother had not needed vengeance. She had needed a room that would have treated her like a human being, when nobody important was watching, and no one had ever built her one. He could build the next person that room. He told the lawyers he would keep the deal on the table, but refused the personal settlement outright, telling them he had no interest in being paid to stay quiet. Instead, he laid out a list of conditions that had nothing to do with his own account, and everything to do with what happened the next time someone who looked like him walked through those doors. Every branch would undergo an independent audit for racial and economic discrimination, conducted by outside investigators rather than the bank's own compliance office. Any decision to freeze or deny an account would require a second manager's approval. Customers would have the explicit right to request independent verification whenever a dispute arose. Employees who reported wrongdoing would be protected from retaliation, a condition he insisted on directly, because of what he had watched happen to Elena. Frontline staff, including guards like Walter, would be trained on when and how to refuse an order that was clearly wrong instead of following it, because it came from above. Camera footage and records could no longer be deleted once a complaint had been filed. Customer rights would be posted publicly inside every branch, in plain language anyone could read, while waiting in line. The bank would publicly disclose how it had handled every complaint it had buried in the past. And Camden Federal would permanently fund the Elias Monroe Fund, seeded with the same amount that had once been turned to ribbons on a lobby floor. The board resisted at first, arguing that some conditions went far beyond what a single incident required. But with the deal, and the company's reputation both in the balance, they had little room to negotiate, and within the week every condition had been written into the final agreement alongside a public timeline for when each change would take effect. Vivian's authority to work in banking was permanently revoked, and she now faced a civil rights claim alongside a charge for filing a false police report. Employees who had helped bury the earlier complaints were placed under formal review. Walter was reinstated once the investigation confirmed what the footage already showed, and he was placed into the very training program Elias had insisted on. When he saw Elias again weeks later, he apologized quietly, wishing he had trusted his own instincts sooner. Elias told him there was nothing left to apologize for, that he remembered clearly how the guard's hand had never once tightened, and he wanted Walter to know that the difference had not gone unnoticed. Elena was kept on, and promoted to assistant branch manager, put in charge of rolling out the training across the region, all because she had been the only person in that lobby willing to speak, while everyone else stayed silent. 3 months later, Elias and Nora walked back through those same glass doors. He still drove the same truck and wore the same coat, unwilling to change anything about himself simply because the world had briefly decided his appearance told the truth about him. Nora held his hand the way she had that first afternoon, though there was nothing tense in her grip this time. An employee greeted them the moment they stepped inside, asking how she could help, before either of them said a word. Nobody's eyes lingered on his coat or his keys. A placard near the entrance listed every customer's rights in plain language beside a number for an independent complaint line that had nothing to do with the branch. Elena came over in her new role, mentioning that the first round of training had already reached every branch in the region. Walter stood near the door in his uniform, and when he caught sight of Elias he offered a small, genuine nod. At one counter a young black mother was opening her son's first savings account, met with none of the suspicion Elias and Nora had faced a season earlier. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Nora watched the scene for a long moment, then turned to her father and asked why he had not simply shut the bank down after everything that happened. Elias thought about it before answering, because he wanted her to understand the words rather than just hear them. Closing a door is easy, he told her. Making it open for everyone is harder. She nodded slowly, the way she did when she was turning an idea over rather than simply accepting it. Before they left, Elias let Nora carry the very first grant letter to a girl being raised by a single mother, a folded page with the name Elias Monroe printed at the top. He watched his daughter hand it, over the same way his own mother had once handed him folded notes she could barely afford the paper for, and he understood that the $4.2 million had never been the thing that mattered. What mattered was that a woman on a bus had once told her son never to agree to be made small, and that 37 years later he had finally found a way to keep that promise for someone other than himself. Father and daughter walked out together and picked up the plans that had been interrupted a season earlier, the bookstore on Hadley Street, and then dinner by the river. If you had been standing in that lobby the day it began, would you have stayed silent behind a raised phone, or would you have been the first to stand up for a father and his daughter? A person should never need $4 million, or the right last name, or a different shade of skin, to be treated with basic respect. Elias did not truly win the afternoon. A powerful man walked in and said his name. He won it 3 months later, at a counter, where a stranger was treated with decency by people who had no idea anyone important was watching, because by then no one important needed to be. Dignity is not a privilege. It is a basic right. This story is a work of fiction. Every event, character, conversation, company, institution, and situation in this narrative is entirely imaginary, created for storytelling, and to explore dignity, fairness, courage, and the human cost of prejudice. Nothing here represents actual events, or should be read as fact. If this story moved you, subscribe for more, and carry the lesson with you the next time you are standing in a room where someone else is being underestimated.